Picture this. August 1945. You're a Japanese soldier dug deep into a concrete bunker on the Manchurian border, certain that your position is impregnable. You've spent months reinforcing these defenses against American attacks that never came. You've trained for banzai charges, prepared for artillery barrages, and steeled yourself for honorable death. But then, without warning, something appears on the horizon that defies everything you were taught to expect. Not American Shermans. Not Chinese infantry. Soviet tanks, yes, but tanks unlike anything in your intelligence briefings. And suddenly, from over 100 meters away, farther than you thought possible, a jet of liquid fire erupts from the turret and races toward your position. The flames don't arc like mortars. They don't fall like bombs. They stream horizontally, a river of fire that pours through your firing slit before you can even comprehend what's happening. In that instant, every assumption about Soviet capabilities, every belief about your fortress, every promise from high command, all of it burns away. That's when Japanese troops in Manchuria discovered that the Red Army had brought something to the battlefield they never imagined. Flame tanks that could incinerate bunkers from distances that seemed impossible. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. By the summer of 1945, the Imperial Japanese Army in Manchuria believed it occupied an almost unassailable position. While the Pacific Islands had fallen one by one to American forces, Manchuria remained a stronghold. The Kwantung Army, once the pride of Japanese military power, had spent years fortifying the border with the Soviet Union. These were not the hasty cave systems of Iwo Jima or the coral bunkers of Okinawa. These were permanent installations, concrete pillboxes reinforced with steel, artillery emplacements carved into hillsides, command bunkers buried under meters of earth, machine gun nests with interlocking fields of fire. The Japanese High Command had poured resources into these defenses throughout the early 1940s, convinced that if the Soviets ever violated their neutrality pact, the Manchurian fortifications would bleed them white. Japanese military doctrine in Manchuria reflected lessons learned from border clashes with the Soviets in the late 1930s. At Khalkhin Gol in 1939, Japanese forces had been mauled by Soviet mechanized warfare. General Georgy Zhukov's combined arms tactics, coordinating tanks, artillery, and aircraft, had shattered Japanese lines and inflicted devastating casualties. Over 18,000 Japanese soldiers died in that engagement. The memory burned deep. So when Japan fortified Manchuria, commanders emphasized static defense. They believed that well-prepared positions could stop Soviet tanks, where mobile warfare had failed. Bunkers were positioned to cover river crossings, mountain passes, and rail lines. Artillery was pre-registered on likely approach routes. Anti-tank guns were dug in with carefully calculated fields of fire. The soldiers manning these positions were not the elite troops of earlier years. By 1945, Japan's best divisions had been bled dry in the Pacific. The Kwantung Army, that had once boasted over 700,000 men, had been stripped of its most capable units, sent south to die on islands with names like Saipan, Guam, and Leyte. What remained were garrison troops, many of them recent conscripts or older reservists. Their training was adequate for defensive warfare, but they lacked the combat experience of veterans who had fought in China or the Pacific. Still, their officers assured them that the fortifications would compensate for any deficiencies. A properly defended bunker, they were told, could hold off a battalion. Japanese intelligence on Soviet capabilities was dangerously outdated. The neutrality pact between Japan and the Soviet Union, signed in 1941, had held throughout the war, with both nations focused on other enemies, Japan fighting America and the Soviets battling Germany. There had been little reason for conflict. This meant Japanese observers had limited access to information about Soviet military developments. What intelligence did filter through came primarily from German sources, and it focused on the European theatre. Japanese officers knew the Soviets had produced enormous numbers of 34 tanks and that their artillery was formidable. But the specific details of Soviet flamethrower tank development were almost completely unknown. The Japanese had their own experience with flamethrowers, of course. During the invasion of China in the 1930s, Japanese engineers had fielded portable flamethrowers like the Type 100. These weapons proved effective in urban warfare, clearing Chinese defenders from buildings and trenches. But they were recognized as short-range weapons, requiring the operator to approach within 30 or 40 meters of the target. Japanese doctrine treated flamethrowers as specialized assault tools, not primary weapons. The idea that flamethrowers could be mounted on tanks and project fire over distances exceeding 100 meters never entered Japanese tactical planning. Their intelligence assessments concluded that Soviet flamethrower technology was similar to their own, perhaps slightly more advanced, but fundamentally limited by the same constraints of range and fuel capacity. This created a catastrophic blind spot. While Japanese engineers reinforced bunkers against artillery and tank shells, they designed firing slits and ventilation systems without considering the threat of fire delivered from extreme range. Bunkers were built to withstand high explosive shells, not streams of burning liquid that could pour through openings and fill interior spaces. Ventilation shafts, essential for allowing gun crews to breathe during prolonged engagements, became potential conduits for flame. The very features that made these bunkers effective against conventional weapons became vulnerabilities once fire entered the equation. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, had been refining flamethrower tank technology since the early years of the war. The experience of fighting Germany had taught the Red Army bitter lessons about fortified positions. During the defense of Moscow in 1941 and the siege of Leningrad, Soviet forces had repeatedly encountered German bunkers and pillboxes that resisted artillery fire. Conventional tanks could suppress these positions, but eliminating them required infantry to close in with satchel charges or grenades, a costly and time-consuming process. Soviet military theorists recognized that a weapon capable of projecting fire over long distances from an armored platform could revolutionize bunker warfare. The result was a series of flame tank designs that evolved throughout the war. Early models, like the KV-8, based on the heavy KV-1 tank, mounted flamethrowers alongside conventional armament. These proved effective, but were produced in limited numbers. As the war progressed, Soviet engineers developed the OT-34, a variant of the 34 medium tank equipped with an ATO-42 flamethrower. This weapon could project burning fuel up to 100 meters, and in optimal conditions even farther. The fuel mixture used was a thickened compound similar to what the Americans called napalm, designed to stick to surfaces and burn intensely. By 1945, the Red Army had accumulated considerable experience with these weapons in urban fighting and assault operations across Eastern Europe. Japanese troops in Manchuria had no knowledge of these developments. Their training manuals did not mention Soviet flame tanks. Their officers had not briefed them on the possibility. Intelligence reports from German allies had focused on Soviet mass production and numerical superiority, not on specific weapons systems like flamethrowers. This ignorance was not mere oversight. It reflected the isolation of the Manchurian garrison, cut off from the main theatres of war, receiving only sporadic updates from Tokyo. The Kwantung Army operated in an information vacuum. Officers clung to assumptions forged in the border clashes of 1939, believing they understood Soviet tactics and capabilities. The strategic situation by August 1945 made this ignorance even more dangerous. Japan was on the verge of collapse. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th had shattered what remained of Japanese morale and industrial capacity. The Soviet Union, sensing an opportunity to seize territory and influence the post-war settlement, prepared to break its neutrality pact and invade Manchuria. Soviet planners understood that speed was essential. A prolonged campaign would allow Japanese forces to regroup or potentially negotiate a conditional surrender. The Red Army needed to smash through Japanese defenses rapidly, overwhelming them before they could establish a coherent defense. This strategic imperative placed enormous importance on weapons that could neutralize fortifications quickly. Flame tanks were central to Soviet planning. In the weeks before the invasion, mechanized units were reinforced with OT-34 flame tanks and other flamethrower-equipped vehicles. These were distributed among the assault columns, positioned to lead attacks on fortified positions. Soviet commanders had studied the Japanese defensive layout through aerial reconnaissance and intelligence from Chinese communist forces. They knew where the major bunker complexes were located and planned their advances to strike these positions with overwhelming force, combining artillery, armor, and flame. For the Japanese soldiers waiting in their bunkers along the Manchurian border, the final days before the invasion were marked by a strange calm. Patrols reported increased Soviet activity across the frontier, but this was not unusual. The Soviets had maintained a large military presence in the Far East throughout the war, and heightened readiness could simply mean defensive preparations. Japanese intelligence officers in Harbin and Mukden sent reassuring reports to Tokyo, noting that while Soviet forces were strong, there were no indications of an imminent attack. After all, the Neutrality Pact still had months before its scheduled expiration. Even as late as August 8, 1945, many Japanese commanders believed they had time to prepare for a potential Soviet move. They were catastrophically wrong. At 1 minute past midnight on August 9, 1945, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. Within hours, over 1.5 million Soviet troops surged across the Manchurian border in a coordinated offensive that stretched over 4,000 miles. 3 Soviet fronts, the Transbaikal, the First Far Eastern, and the Second Far Eastern, advanced simultaneously, overwhelming Japanese positions with speed and firepower that defied every assumption the defenders had held. And at the tip of this assault, rolling forward with the lead tank columns, were the flame tanks that Japanese soldiers had never imagined existed. The Soviet OT-34 flame tank was not a hasty improvisation. It was the product of years of combat experience and deliberate engineering. Based on the legendary 34 medium tank, which had proven itself as one of the finest armoured vehicles of World War II, the OT-34 retained most of its parent strengths, while adding a devastating new capability. The Base 34 was renowned for its sloped armour, reliable diesel engine, and excellent cross-country mobility. Soviet tankers loved it for its simplicity and durability. It could operate in conditions that would disable more complex vehicles, and its wide tracks distributed weight effectively, allowing it to traverse mud, snow, and rough terrain with ease. The flamethrower variant modified this proven design in specific ways. The most visible change was the replacement of the hull-mounted machine gun with the AT-042 flamethrower. This weapon projected a jet of thickened fuel through a nozzle that could be aimed independently of the main gun. The fuel itself was a viscous mixture, often based on petroleum thickened with additives to increase its adhesive properties and burn temperature. When ignited, it produced a stream of fire that could reach distances of 90 to 130 meters, depending on wind conditions and the pressure in the fuel tanks. This was a staggering range compared to portable flamethrowers, which typically maxed out around 30 to 40 meters. The fuel for the flamethrower was stored in armored tanks within the hull, replacing some of the ammunition storage for the main gun. An OT-34 typically carried around 100 liters of flamethrower fuel, enough for approximately 10 bursts of sustained fire. Each burst lasted several seconds, creating a torrent of flame that could saturate a target area. The ignition system used a simple but reliable method, injecting the fuel stream past an electrical igniter that lit it as it left the nozzle. The result was a weapon that combined the 34's mobility and armor protection with the ability to project fire over distances that no infantry portable weapon could match. Soviet doctrine for employing flame tanks had evolved considerably by 1945. Early in the war, flamethrower vehicles were often used in a support role, brought forward to deal with specific strong points after conventional tanks had engaged the enemy. But experience in urban fighting, particularly during the battles for Stalingrad, Kursk, and the assault on Berlin, demonstrated that flame tanks were most effective when integrated directly into assault formations. Soviet commanders learned to position them in the first wave, using their psychological impact to break enemy morale before the main engagement even began. The tactics were straightforward but brutally effective. As mechanized columns approached a fortified position, flame tanks would advance under covering fire from conventional tanks and self-propelled guns. Once within range, typically 100 meters or less, the flame tanks would unleash their weapons against bunkers, pillboxes, and trench lines. The goal was not necessarily to kill every defender, though the flamethrower certainly could do that. The primary objective was to force defenders out of their positions, either through death, suffocation, or sheer terror, so that supporting infantry could overrun the defenses with minimal casualties. Soviet tankers who crewed these vehicles understood both their power and their vulnerabilities. The OT-34 retained the 34's armor, which was effective against most anti-tank weapons at medium range. The sloped frontal armor, up to 45 millimeters thick at optimal angles, could deflect many hits, but the crew knew that carrying flammable fuel made their vehicle a potential death trap if penetrated. Anti-tank rounds that might merely disable a conventional tank could ignite the fuel tanks in a flame variant, incinerating the crew. This knowledge created a particular kind of courage among flame tank crews. They were advancing into the teeth of enemy defenses, carrying volatile cargo, knowing that a single lucky hit could turn their vehicle into a funeral pyre. The psychological training of Soviet flame tank crews emphasized speed and aggression. They were taught to close the distance quickly, minimizing the time enemy gunners had to target them. Once in range, they were to fire immediately and continuously, saturating the target with flame before withdrawing to reload or reposition. Soviet doctrine stressed that the flamethrower's psychological effect was as important as its physical damage. Reports from the European theatre noted that German defenders often abandoned positions after witnessing flame attacks, even if they themselves had not been directly targeted. The mere sight of a tank spewing fire over 100 meters created panic that conventional weapons could not match. Japanese anti-tank defenses in Manchuria were designed around a different threat model. Their intelligence assumed Soviet armor would follow conventional patterns, advancing to firing positions and engaging with main guns at ranges of 500 to 1,000 meters. Japanese anti-tank guns, primarily the Type 1 47mm and the Type 94 37mm, were sighted to cover these expected engagement distances. Bunkers and pillboxes were built with firing slits that allowed defenders to engage tanks at medium to long range while remaining protected from return fire. This doctrine had worked reasonably well in earlier conflicts and in defensive planning exercises, but it was predicated on the assumption that Soviet tanks would behave predictably. The arrival of flame tanks shattered these assumptions. A weapon that could project fire from 100 meters meant that Japanese defenders had to engage at much closer ranges than planned, ranges where the psychological impact of incoming fire was far more intense. And because the flamethrower could reach through firing slits and ventilation openings, the very features designed to protect defenders became avenues of attack. A bunker designed to withstand a 76mm tank shell was helpless against a stream of burning liquid that poured through its gun port and filled the interior with fire and smoke. The fuel used in Soviet flamethrowers was particularly terrifying in its effects. Thickened petroleum compounds clung to whatever they touched, continuing to burn even after the initial jet had dissipated. Concrete and steel might not burn, but the fuel stuck to these surfaces, creating intense heat that made bunkers uninhabitable. Wooden support beams, camouflage materials, stored ammunition, all of these ignited, turning defensive positions into ovens. Defenders caught in the direct stream had no chance. Those farther back in the bunker faced suffocation as the fire consumed available oxygen. Even those who survived the initial attack often suffered severe burns, smoke inhalation, or psychological trauma that rendered them combat ineffective. Soviet engineers had calculated these effects carefully. Tests conducted on captured German bunkers in Eastern Europe demonstrated that even a brief burst of flame into a confined space could incapacitate everyone inside within seconds. The heat alone, reaching temperatures over 1,000 degrees Celsius in the immediate burn area, was enough to cause fatal injuries. The smoke produced by burning petroleum was thick and toxic, filling bunkers and cutting off visibility and breathable air, and the psychological impact of being trapped in a burning, smoke-filled space broke the morale of even well-trained troops. By the time the Soviet invasion of Manchuria began on August 9, 1945, the Red Army had refined these tactics to a lethal science. Flame tanks were integrated into every major assault column. They advanced with the lead elements, protected by conventional armor and supported by infantry. Their mission was simple but devastating: burn out every fortified position in their path, shatter Japanese morale, and clear the way for the rapid advance that Soviet strategy demanded. And the Japanese soldiers, waiting in their bunkers, confident in their concrete and steel, had absolutely no idea what was about to hit them. The initial Soviet assault on August 9th was a masterpiece of coordination and overwhelming force. At dawn, after a brief but intense artillery barrage, Soviet mechanized columns surged forward across multiple axes. The Transbaikal Front, commanded by Marshal Rodion Malinovsky, drove eastward from Mongolia across the Gobi Desert and the Greater Khingan mountain range. The First Far Eastern Front, under Marshal Kirill Meretskov, attacked from the east, pushing into Manchuria from Soviet territories along the Ussuri River. The Second Far Eastern Front, led by General Maxim Pukayev, advanced from the north, crossing the Amur River. Each front deployed thousands of tanks, self-propelled guns, and mechanized infantry, supported by overwhelming air superiority. Japanese defenders in the forward positions realized something was catastrophically wrong within the first hours. The speed of the Soviet advance defied their expectations. Intelligence had suggested that if the Soviets attacked, they would proceed cautiously, probing defenses and consolidating gains before pushing deeper. Instead, Soviet columns bypassed strong points when possible and smashed through them when necessary. Tank formations advanced 50, 60, even 70 kilometers in a single day, outpacing anything Japanese planners had anticipated. Communications broke down almost immediately as Soviet aircraft and artillery targeted command posts and communication lines. Japanese units found themselves isolated, unable to coordinate with neighboring positions or receive orders from higher headquarters. It was in this chaotic environment that Japanese troops first encountered Soviet flame tanks. The initial contacts came along the main invasion routes, where Soviet mechanized columns hit fortified positions that could not be bypassed. A typical engagement would begin with Soviet artillery pounding the area around a bunker complex, suppressing any Japanese infantry in the open, and forcing defenders to take cover inside their fortifications. Then, as the barrage lifted, Soviet tanks would advance. Conventional 34s and heavier IS-2 tanks would engage any visible targets with their main guns, destroying weapon emplacements and forcing Japanese anti-tank guns to reveal their positions. And then the flame tanks would move forward. Japanese defenders watching from their bunkers would see what appeared to be ordinary 34s advancing to close range. The distinctiveness of the OT-34's flamethrower nozzle was not obvious at a distance, and in the confusion of battle, with smoke and dust obscuring visibility, they looked like standard Soviet armor. Japanese gunners would prepare to engage, waiting for the tanks to enter effective range for their anti-tank weapons. But before they could fire, something utterly unexpected would happen. At ranges exceeding 100 meters, far beyond what any Japanese soldier thought possible for a flamethrower, the Soviet tank would erupt in fire. Not the flash of a cannon, not the tracer rounds of a machine gun, but a sustained jet of liquid flame that streamed toward the bunker like a dragon's breath. The fuel, thickened to maintain cohesion over distance, would arc through the air and splash against the bunker's facade, pouring through firing slits and ventilation openings. Within seconds, the interior of the bunker would be engulfed. The flames would ignite everything combustible, consuming oxygen and filling the space with choking smoke. Defenders caught directly in the stream would die almost instantly, their bodies charred beyond recognition. Those farther back would scramble to escape, but bunkers designed to be defensible from the outside were often death traps from the inside once fire took hold. Survivors who managed to flee from rear exits would emerge into a hellscape. Soviet infantry, advancing behind the tanks, would cut them down with rifle and machine gun fire. Those who surrendered, stunned and burned, would be taken prisoner. Those who tried to fight were quickly overwhelmed, and all the while, the flame tanks would continue their work, moving from one bunker to the next, systematically incinerating Japanese defensive positions that had been expected to hold for days or weeks. The psychological impact on Japanese troops was immediate and devastating. Soldiers who had steeled themselves to face artillery, who had trained to resist tank assaults, who had accepted the likelihood of death in battle, found themselves confronting something outside the bounds of their experience. The range of the flamethrower was the critical factor. Japanese doctrine assumed that if they faced flamethrowers, the enemy would have to approach within 30 or 40 meters, giving defenders time to engage the operator. But Soviet flame tanks struck from distances where Japanese troops felt they should have been safe. The result was a collapse of the mental framework that allowed soldiers to function under fire. Reports from Japanese survivors, recorded after the war during interrogations and in written accounts, consistently describe a sense of helplessness. One soldier recalled watching a Soviet tank approach his bunker from over 100 meters away. He and his comrades prepared to fire their anti-tank rifle, confident they would have time to engage. Then the tank unleashed fire, and within moments the bunker was filled with flames and smoke. He survived only because he was near a rear exit and managed to flee before the heat became lethal. But most of his unit died inside, trapped by the very fortifications that were supposed to protect them. Another account describes a machine gun position overlooking a river crossing. The Japanese defenders had carefully constructed interlocking fields of fire, confident they could repel any assault. When Soviet tanks appeared on the opposite bank, the Japanese opened fire, scoring several hits. But then one of the tanks, an OT-34, fired its flamethrower across the river. The stream of fire arced over the water, a distance of nearly 120 meters, and struck the machine gun nest. The position was engulfed in seconds. Survivors fled downstream, abandoning their weapons and position. The crossing, which Japanese planners had expected to hold for at least a day, fell in under an hour. The speed of the Soviet advance was directly tied to the effectiveness of these flame tank attacks. Bunkers that might have required prolonged sieges, costing time and casualties, were neutralized in minutes. Soviet mechanized columns maintained their momentum, rolling over Japanese defenses that collapsed under the combined weight of fire, armor, and shock. By the end of the first day, Soviet forces had penetrated deep into Manchuria, advancing faster than their own supply lines could follow. The Japanese Kwantung Army, which had believed its fortifications would provide time for reinforcements and counterattacks, found itself fragmented and reeling. Japanese commanders struggling to make sense of the disaster sent frantic reports to higher headquarters. Radio messages intercepted by Soviet intelligence revealed confusion and despair. Officers reported entire defensive lines collapsing, bunkers abandoned, and units disintegrating under attacks they did not understand. Some reports mentioned fire attacks of unprecedented range, but in the chaos of battle, accurate details were scarce. Tokyo, already reeling from the atomic bombings and the shock of the Soviet declaration of war, had little ability to respond. The Kwantung Army was on its own, and as the first day of the invasion gave way to the second, then the third, it became clear that the Soviet offensive was not slowing. Flame tanks continued to lead the assault, burning through Japanese defenses with methodical efficiency. The fortifications that had taken years to build, the bunkers that Japanese soldiers had trusted to keep them safe, all of it was reduced to smoking ruins in a matter of days. The psychological dominance that the Soviets achieved through these attacks was as important as the physical destruction. Japanese troops, witnessing position after position incinerated, began to lose the will to resist. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The collapse of Japanese defenses in Manchuria was not uniform, but the pattern repeated itself across hundreds of miles of frontier. Wherever Soviet flame tanks appeared, the result was the same. Fortified positions that should have held for days fell in hours. The combination of fire, shock, and speed shattered the Japanese ability to mount coherent resistance, and as the invasion progressed, the true scope of Japan's miscalculation became horrifyingly apparent. One of the most striking examples occurred along the defensive line near the town of Mutanchiang, a key rail junction in eastern Manchuria. Japanese forces had fortified the surrounding hills with bunkers and artillery positions, creating a layered defense designed to slow any Soviet advance from the east. The First Far Eastern Front, attacking from that direction, encountered these defenses on August 10th. Soviet planners knew Mutanchiang was critical. If the town fell quickly, the rail lines would allow rapid movement of supplies and reinforcements deeper into Manchuria. If it held, the offensive could bog down. Soviet commanders committed significant forces to the assault, including multiple battalions equipped with OT-34 flame tanks. The attack began with an artillery barrage that lasted several hours, pounding Japanese positions and destroying communication lines. As the barrage lifted, Soviet armor advanced in waves. Japanese anti-tank guns opened fire, destroying several 34s and forcing others to maneuver for cover. For a brief moment, it seemed the defenses might hold. Then the flame tanks advanced to the front. Japanese defenders watched in growing horror as tanks they assumed were conventional, 34s, began projecting fire at ranges exceeding 100 meters. Bunkers that had survived the artillery barrage were engulfed in flames within minutes. One position after another fell silent, consumed by fire or abandoned by terrified defenders. A Japanese artillery observer, positioned on a hill overlooking the battlefield, recorded his observations in a diary that was later recovered. He described the Soviet attack as resembling something from a nightmare: tanks that breathed fire like dragons, flames that reached across distances he thought impossible, bunkers that had been built to last for months burning like kindling. His final entry, written before he abandoned his position and fled, noted that resistance was useless. The Soviets had brought weapons that made fortifications meaningless. By August 11th, Mutanchiang was in Soviet hands. The defensive line that Japanese planners had expected to hold for a week had collapsed in less than 2 days. The use of flame tanks was not limited to static fortifications. Soviet forces also employed them in urban combat as they advanced into Manchurian cities. Harbin, the largest city in northern Manchuria, fell to Soviet forces on August 20th after a brief but intense battle. Japanese defenders had prepared the city for street fighting, fortifying buildings, and creating strongpoints at key intersections. Soviet commanders, mindful of the bloody urban battles they had fought in Europe, particularly during the assault on Berlin, used flame tanks to clear Japanese positions with minimal casualties to their own troops. The OT-34's ability to project fire into buildings proved devastatingly effective in urban environments. A typical engagement would see Soviet infantry advancing under cover while flame tanks moved forward to engage fortified buildings. The tank would position itself at a street corner or behind cover, then unleash a burst of fire through windows or doorways. The thickened fuel would splash into the interior, igniting everything flammable and forcing defenders to flee or die. Soviet infantry would then storm the building, clearing it room by room, while the flame tank moved on to the next target. This methodical approach minimized Soviet casualties while maximizing the terror inflicted on Japanese defenders. Civilians caught in these urban battles faced horrific conditions. Many had been unable or unwilling to evacuate before the Soviet advance, and now found themselves trapped in a war zone where fire was being used as a primary weapon. Soviet forces did not distinguish clearly between military and civilian structures, and flame attacks on fortified buildings sometimes ignited surrounding areas, causing widespread fires. The human cost in cities like Harbin was substantial, though exact figures remain uncertain due to the chaos of the period and the subsequent Soviet occupation. Japanese officers attempting to organize resistance in Harbin quickly realized that conventional urban defense tactics were useless against flame tanks. Buildings that should have provided cover became death traps once fire was introduced. Orders to hold positions at all costs resulted in units being incinerated rather than mounting effective defences. By the time Harbin fell, the Japanese garrison had largely disintegrated. Some units surrendered en masse, others fled into the countryside, abandoning their equipment. A few fought to the end, dying in burning buildings rather than retreating. But the outcome was never in doubt. Soviet firepower, and particularly the psychological impact of flame attacks, had broken Japanese resistance completely. The speed of the Soviet advance created a cascading effect on Japanese morale throughout Manchuria. As news of flame tank attacks spread, either through radio communications or fleeing soldiers, units that had not yet encountered them began to lose cohesion. Japanese military culture emphasized discipline and obedience, but it also relied on the belief that sacrifice in defense would serve a larger strategic purpose. Once that belief eroded, once soldiers realized that their bunkers offered no protection and their resistance would achieve nothing, the willingness to fight to the death evaporated. This was particularly evident in the later stages of the campaign. By mid-August, as Soviet forces penetrated deeper into Manchuria, Japanese units increasingly chose to surrender rather than face incineration. Soviet commanders noted with surprise how rapidly resistance collapsed in some areas. Positions that intelligence had identified as heavily fortified were found abandoned, their garrisons having fled before Soviet forces even arrived. The terror inspired by flame tanks had begun to precede the actual weapons, creating a psychological shockwave that undermined Japanese defenses across the theater. The Japanese High Command in Tokyo was aware of the disaster unfolding in Manchuria, but by August 15, 1945, when Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, there was little that could be done. The combination of atomic bombings, the Soviet invasion, and the collapse of defenses in Manchuria had made continued resistance untenable. The Kwantung Army, once a symbol of Japanese military power, had been shattered in less than a week. Estimates of Japanese casualties vary, but by the time fighting ceased in late August, hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured. Soviet casualties were far lower, a testament to the effectiveness of their tactics and technology. The role of flame tanks in achieving this decisive victory cannot be overstated. While Soviet numerical superiority and coordination were critical factors, it was the flame tank's ability to neutralize fortifications rapidly that allowed the Red Army to maintain its devastating pace. Japanese bunkers and pillboxes, which might have slowed a conventional assault for days or weeks, fell in minutes when attacked by OT-34s. This speed prevented Japanese forces from regrouping, ensured that Soviet supply lines could keep pace with the advance, and shattered Japanese morale to the point where organized resistance became impossible. Soviet after-action reports from the Manchurian campaign praised the flame tank's performance. Commanders noted that positions attacked by flamethrowers typically fell with minimal friendly casualties. Infantry advancing behind flame tanks reported facing little resistance, as defenders either fled or were incapacitated by the initial fire attack. Tankers operating the OT-34s developed confidence in their weapons, understanding that few fortifications could withstand sustained flame attacks. This confidence translated into aggressive tactics, with flame tanks often leading assaults rather than supporting from behind. Japanese survivors of the campaign carried the memory of flame tanks for the rest of their lives. Post-war interviews with former soldiers consistently described the weapons as the most terrifying aspect of the Soviet invasion. Many noted that they had been prepared to face conventional weapons, even to die in battle, but the flames broke their spirit in ways that bullets and shells could not. One veteran recalled that seeing a bunker engulfed in fire from over 100 meters away made him realize that no defense could protect them. He surrendered at the first opportunity, choosing captivity over incineration. The technological and tactical lessons from the Manchurian campaign influenced both Soviet and later military doctrine. The Red Army continued to develop and field flame tanks in the post-war period, viewing them as essential tools for assault operations. During the Cold War, Soviet mechanized forces included flamethrower-equipped vehicles in their order of battle, ready to neutralize NATO bunkers and fortifications in the event of a European conflict. The principles demonstrated in Manchuria that fire could break fortified defenses faster and more decisively than conventional weapons became embedded in Soviet military thinking. For Japan, the Manchurian campaign represented the final collapse of a defensive strategy that had been built on flawed assumptions. The belief that fortifications could offset material disadvantages, that bunkers would buy time for negotiated settlements, that Soviet capabilities were limited, all of these assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. The flame tanks were the most visible symbol of this failure. They demonstrated that innovation and technology could render even the most elaborate defenses obsolete. Japanese bunkers, built at great cost in material and labor, became tombs for the men inside them once fire reached through their openings. The psychological dimension of the campaign is particularly striking when examined through the lens of military culture. The Japanese army's emphasis on fighting to the death, on honor through sacrifice, was predicated on the belief that such sacrifice would inspire future resistance or deter enemy aggression. But flame tanks undermined this entire framework. Death by fire offered no honor, no inspiration. It was simply horrific. Soldiers who might have accepted death in a banzai charge or during a last stand could not accept being burned alive in a bunker with no chance to fight back. This psychological break was as important to the Soviet victory as any tactical advantage. The legacy of the Manchurian campaign extended beyond the immediate military outcome. The rapid Soviet conquest of Manchuria altered the post-war balance of power in East Asia. Soviet control of Manchurian territory and resources influenced the Chinese Civil War, as communist forces under Mao Zedong received significant support from Soviet occupation authorities. The Japanese population of Manchuria, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, faced brutal conditions during and after the Soviet invasion. Many died from exposure, starvation, or violence. The collapse of Japanese military power removed the primary obstacle to Soviet expansion in the region, reshaping the geopolitical landscape for decades. The flame tanks themselves became a footnote in broader histories of World War II, overshadowed by the atomic bombings and the dramatic surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri. But for those who experienced them, for the Japanese soldiers who watched fire stream from Soviet tanks at impossible ranges, for the civilians who saw their cities burn, the flame tanks were the embodiment of a new kind of warfare. They represented technology harnessed for maximum psychological impact, weapons designed not just to kill but to terrify, to break the enemy's will before the battle even began. Soviet military historians after the war analyzed the Manchurian campaign in detail, seeking to understand what had made the offensive so successful. The speed of the advance, the low casualty rates, and the complete collapse of Japanese resistance were all attributed to superior planning, overwhelming force, and the effective use of combined arms. But within these analyses, the role of flame tanks was consistently highlighted. Reports noted that wherever flame tanks were employed, defensive positions fell rapidly. The psychological effect on enemy morale was judged to be as important as the physical destruction inflicted. The development of flamethrower technology did not end with World War II. Both the Soviet Union and Western powers continued to refine these weapons, seeking to improve range, fuel capacity, and effectiveness. In the Korean War, American forces used flamethrower tanks against North Korean and Chinese bunkers, rediscovering the lessons that the Soviets had demonstrated in Manchuria. Later, during the Vietnam War, flamethrowers and napalm became controversial symbols of modern warfare's brutality. But the fundamental principle remained unchanged. Fire projected from a protected platform could neutralize fortifications more effectively than conventional weapons. In the decades following World War II, international humanitarian law began to address the use of incendiary weapons. Protocols added to the Geneva Conventions sought to limit the use of fire against civilian populations and to regulate its employment in military operations. These efforts reflected a growing recognition that weapons like flamethrowers, while militarily effective, inflicted suffering that extended beyond traditional battlefield norms. The memories of Manchuria, along with the firebombing of cities and the use of napalm in later conflicts, contributed to these legal and ethical debates. For the Japanese survivors of the Manchurian campaign, the post-war years were marked by efforts to make sense of the disaster. Many struggled to reconcile the speed of the collapse with their training and beliefs. Veterans' accounts often expressed a sense of betrayal, not by their comrades, but by the system that had assured them their fortifications were adequate. The realization that Soviet technology had rendered years of defensive preparation meaningless was a bitter pill. Some found solace in the broader narrative of Japan's defeat, accepting that the atomic bombs and Soviet invasion had made surrender inevitable. Others remained haunted by the memory of flames pouring into bunkers, of comrades dying in fire, of defenses that had promised safety but delivered only death. The civilian population of Manchuria faced even grimmer fates. The Soviet invasion and occupation brought widespread violence and displacement. Japanese civilians who had settled in Manchuria during the occupation found themselves stranded when Japanese forces collapsed. Soviet troops, many of whom had endured years of brutal warfare against Germany, showed little mercy. Looting, assault, and summary executions were common. The breakdown of civil order, combined with the onset of winter, led to mass suffering. Tens of thousands died in the months following the invasion, from cold, hunger, disease, and violence. The flame tanks that had broken the Japanese military became symbols of a larger catastrophe that engulfed an entire population. The strategic impact of the Manchurian campaign on the end of World War II remains a subject of historical debate. Some argue that the Soviet invasion was the decisive factor in Japan's decision to surrender, more so than the atomic bombings. The argument holds that the loss of Manchuria, with its industrial resources and the Kwantung Army's collapse, demonstrated to Japanese leaders that continued resistance was impossible. Others contend that the atomic bombs were the primary driver, shocking Japan's government into acceptance of unconditional surrender. The reality is likely that both factors, along with the cumulative exhaustion of years of war, combined to force Japan's hand. What is undeniable is that the speed and decisiveness of the Soviet victory in Manchuria was achieved through a combination of superior numbers, tactical innovation, and weapons that exploited Japanese vulnerabilities. The flame tanks were a critical component of this success. They allowed Soviet forces to maintain momentum, neutralizing fortifications that might otherwise have required prolonged sieges. They shattered Japanese morale, turning confident defenders into terrified refugees, and they demonstrated the power of psychological warfare, showing that the fear of a weapon could be as devastating as the weapon itself. In the years following the war, Soviet military academies studied the Manchurian campaign as a model of successful offensive operations. The integration of armor, infantry, artillery, and air power, all advancing in coordinated thrusts, became a cornerstone of Soviet doctrine. The use of specialized vehicles like flame tanks to overcome specific obstacles was emphasized in training. Soviet officers learned that speed and shock could achieve results that attrition and siege warfare could not. These lessons shaped Soviet military thinking throughout the Cold War, influencing everything from the structure of mechanized divisions to the development of new weapons systems. For Japan, the Manchurian campaign became a painful chapter in the larger story of defeat. The Kwantung Army, once the pride of the empire, was destroyed not in a heroic last stand, but in a chaotic rout. The fortifications that were supposed to protect Manchuria became symbols of miscalculation and failure, and the flame tanks, weapons that Japanese commanders had never anticipated, became emblems of how decisively technology and innovation could overturn traditional military calculations. The soldiers who had trusted their bunkers learned too late that concrete and steel offered no protection against fire that could reach through every opening and consume everything in its path. The story of Soviet flame tanks in Manchuria is not just a tale of weapons and tactics. It is a story about the collision between expectation and reality, between what soldiers were trained to face and what they actually encountered. Japanese troops in Manchuria believed they understood modern warfare. They had fought in China, witnessed the capabilities of various armies, and built defences accordingly. But they had never imagined that an enemy would field tanks capable of projecting fire over 100 meters, turning their strongest positions into death traps. That failure of imagination, that gap between what they knew and what they faced, cost them everything. In the broader context of World War II, the Manchurian campaign represents a culmination of trends that had been developing throughout the conflict. The importance of combined arms, the integration of technology and tactics, the use of psychological warfare, all of these elements came together in a devastating demonstration of modern military power. The flame tanks were a perfect symbol of this evolution. They combined mobility, protection, and firepower in a package designed to overcome the specific challenge of fortified defences. They were not a magical weapon, but a practical solution to a tactical problem, refined through years of combat experience and deployed with ruthless efficiency. The Japanese soldiers who faced these weapons were not cowards or failures. They were men who had been given an impossible task, defending positions with weapons and tactics that were inadequate against the technology arrayed against them. Their training emphasized courage and sacrifice, but courage alone could not stop fire from pouring into bunkers. Sacrifice without the means to inflict significant damage on the enemy was simply waste. The tragedy of the Manchurian campaign was that so many Japanese soldiers died not in heroic stands but in burning fortifications, overwhelmed by weapons they never expected and could not defeat. The Soviet soldiers who operated the flame tanks were professionals executing a mission with deadly competence. They understood the power of their weapons and the fear they inspired. Accounts from Soviet tankers describe a certain grim satisfaction in watching fortifications collapse under flame attacks, knowing that each position destroyed meant fewer casualties among their own infantry. They were not sadists, but soldiers who had learned through bitter experience that mercy in war was a luxury few could afford. The Manchurian campaign came at the end of years of brutal fighting, and Soviet troops brought to it all the hard-won lessons of the Eastern Front. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.